Hey folks, welcome to another Snapp Tech podcast with me and Jasper. We wanted to talk today about open source software and usability, productizing open source. This kind of follow up from FOSDEM, I think, and in general what we've been doing a lot. So I thought I would kick off. I've been doing a little bit reading. I've been looking into computer science papers about open source and usability specifically. And like in general, I think academia is pretty good at identifying problems, but it's also relatively poor of proposing real-life solutions. And maybe it's my bias, but that's how I kind of feel when I was reading these papers. There's a really wealth of research into open source software and lack of usability. They've identified the same problems that we expect there to be, but it's good to have like statistically significant take on this one. The problems that they identify is that in general in open source, due to the nature of the projects, the usability comes too late. It's a kind of side effect of people building software for themselves and the people being generally developers and developers. When you start building software for yourself, you have very good understanding of the data model, how things work, how the code works and all of that. And if you happen to be a developer who doesn't have deep understanding of usability design or user interface design, you accidentally build user interface that reflects the data structure. And it caters to mental model of the data and not a mental model of potential outside user or third-party user who comes into that one. And now you have a user interface that's accidentally designed. And because most projects start as hobbies, it's unfeasible to ask developers, to ask designers to join in early phases because most projects never lead into anything. And once it's popular, it already has an interface that was accidentally created. So now you have a situation where it's a bit too late to start with the process and all of those things, and starting and would have to stop and redo the thing. But that to go to that point, the project owners would have to have good understanding what needs to be done and so on.
So I think this problem is not just limited to open source, by the way. No. I mean, we'll focus on open source today, but your description coming at the start really made me think of my experience using Azure. Maybe they've improved it, but for quite a while, the whole user interface was very clearly driven by data models. Mm-hmm. So this is I think it's a bigger problem in open source. It's kind of amplified in the world of open source, but I think it's a generalized problem where technical products started by technical people seem to reflect that thinking rather than user-centric products started by product people reflect the user. So I think that's the generalized view of it.
For sure, and you and I, we lived in our previous lives. We were building back-end software quite a bit, right?
Right.
And in that world, that was definitely the case. And then we drifted slowly into mobile software, where due to many different things, but a lot is credited to Apple bringing the user-centered thinking from iPhone, even to the Android world. And that was a little bit feels like it's a little bit like bubble. We were in this world where usability and user-centered design was very important. And now we're getting back into open source and all of these kind of things that again, it's kind of not well understood what it means. And what these researchers found is that a lot of open source developers, again, it's very clear, I don't want to blame people. It's an understandable thing because they don't have the knowledge. But a lot of open source developers especially think that usability is a subjective opinion thing. You know, it's just your thing. Or the other kind of alternative, what is often perceived is that, well, it's just colors, you know, it's just visuals. And it's much more. It's about helping people to understand how your software works, right?
Actually, I've got a book on my bookshelf called what's it called now? Design Index or something. I bought many years ago, which I keep looking at, and it tries to create some sort of set of rules about design. Now design can't be done. It's not like painting by numbers. You can't create great design just by following rules. But there's got to be some design language. That's a bit of a confusing term, but we got to have some patterns of design if we want open source developers to be able to create good designs. Maybe there's an opening here for some design patterns. And I say design patterns not from a technical side, but from a visual and usability side. And so maybe that's an interesting topic to talk about is generalized patterns of design that could be used in open source projects that at least allow a kind of a toolkit approach. I think actually Bootstrap has done a really great job of allowing developers to create good looking UIs, right? So, I think there are precedents for this. I don't think we should just say that design is some mystery that happens by designers and nobody else can figure it out. I think it's not an unsolvable problem. Right?
It depends a little bit what level you think about design. Because if you think about usability, it's much more than UI. And it's much more than choosing the right patterns for UI. Writing right components, writing. It's all about from information architecture to data flows and all of this kind of things. And that generally is a point where to improve that one, you have to stop and you have to go back and redo. I sent you a video today about, I will link into this description as well, this Audacity redesign, which is a very good view into this kind of very popular open source project with a very bad user interface, but a lot of fans of that very user interface. People get used to bad interface and they get tied into that one. Okay, I know how to use that, and you change that one, any change is resisted and so on. There's also pervasive opinion in the nerd circles that software is not supposed to be easy to use. You're supposed to kind of struggle to find the use, and then you win that one. And I remember years ago, I had a discussion with my dad about Microsoft Office, for example, and there's an interesting psychological pattern that happens when you spend a lot of effort learning something. Then you assume it's good, because if you spend a lot of effort learning something that's bad, that's you're a stupid person, right? And nobody thinks themselves a stupid person. So there's these things that people lock into this very difficult to use software and these patterns because it's this bias, this natural human bias that drives you into these kind of things. And then it's very difficult to justify a redesign or you change something and it becomes difficult. Right?
But it's utility of it. I remember a project I worked on where the plan was to replace an accounting system with a web-based UI. The existing accounting system was all terminal-based. And you would think, oh my God, everyone would hate using the terminal-based system. But all the accounting team, the finance team loved it because they had built up the muscle memory. And it was super fast and super effective. And the idea of a web-based UI, we got lots of stones thrown at us in that project. Because
this is a great example of saying
the utility
usability is different than visual design and that the user interface. We had the same experience in a design agency I worked in where we were redesigning a very highly used professional package tracking software. Like it was used by a team that really were doing console-based command shortcuts things, and the design agency designed a web-based interface to do that thing, and it looked great and it was very intuitive. But it wasn't the point. It didn't need to be super intuitive. Like expert systems have different requirements for usability. So when people have really learned to use them very quickly, console might be a very good thing. But it doesn't mean you can't create a very good expert system that's also intuitive. So, but this requires a lot of skill to do so.
So the point I was trying to make is not that it's about visual design, though. The point I'm trying to make is that there must be some patterns in usability design as well. If we consider usability design as a constantly unique property of every system, then from an open source perspective, we're essentially saying every open source system needs to be designed from the ground up, right? Or have designers, usability and user experience designers coming in from the ground up. And maybe that's sort of true. Yeah, I don't know. But thinking about our experience over the last 10 years in the mobile world, so many times, especially in the early days, designers try to reinvent the entire mobile experience. You know, the navigation paradigms they try to reinvent. They try to put layers on top of what was already there. And there were some interaction points that were, you know, once you agreed that those were the kind of like the immutable parts of the usability, you had to work with them. And good design is always based on constraints, right? So I think for this to scale, I mean, maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but for usability to become a standard part of open source, we've got to go beyond the saying somebody comes in as a designer in the early stages, and we've got to start thinking about patterns of usability so that they can be baked in from day one.
That's exactly it, because it's due to the nature of this project is unrealistic. So that's what I read for a lot of these papers as well, saying, well, the solution is to include designers in the early phase, but that's not realistic. That's not possible. We have to look at the constraints, saying, well, this won't happen. Like, that's not the case. But I think there's kind of multiple layers of approach on this one. One of those things is just UI patterns. That's something I spent 10 years blogging about on Android, saying, you know, if you don't know how to solve a thing, take this pattern and put it there. It's better than reinventing the wheel. People understand how to do action bar on Android. That was one of the early ones.
Right.
They know how to pull to refresh works. If you need to refresh a list, you pull, right? That was introduced there. Everybody knows that's an interaction model that works. So you can go this, but this is quite low level things. This is the things when once you kind of have the whole interface already there, then you design the details. That really leads into better or maybe less bad software already by just picking the right solutions for individual users patterns. But I think there's an alternative for this one. We need to accept the reality that most software projects become mature before interaction design or user interface design is involved. But if we advocate understanding a importance of usability, because that's one of the research have recognized that a lot of the developers don't understand that it's not subjective opinion, it's actually important part, equally important as performance or security, all of those things. It has to be on the same level with those things. There's an advocacy work that needs to be done in there. The second thing is that if software engineers understand that a redesign is coming, and that's baked into the way of thinking of the initial software development, it's actually not so much work. The huge work comes from the reality that you build something and you don't think about the eventual rewrite of the interface. Then it's very difficult to put it in. But if you have prepared yourself into that one, at least you kind of have it in the back of your mind saying, okay, well, the interface might change. On a fundamental level, I don't mean colors on the screen. I mean the ordering of the screens, the way data is inputted, onboarding, all of those things might change in the future. And if you bake that into your thinking, even if you don't actively plan for it, it will change the level of effort needed later on. But that requires that these developers understand the importance of design. And I think looking at the back of our experience in mobile, that's possible because that happened there. That's literally, we went from early phases of Android especially, where people didn't care, to a point where even every single hobby developer did care about the usability. They were thinking about onboarding. They think about all of these things. But there's kind of this, I think it's like a fundamental educational thing that needs to be done. And I see a lot of reflections of what we went through in the mobile, on the Android side of mobile. For example, one thing that was in early phase of Android hobby projects was very pervasive was that user interface wasn't really built to complete. Instead of, it was built as part of settings. So you have settings. Do you want to have bar top? You want it there? Do you want to have this or that, or what it's going to be? And this comes from, I think, fundamental misunderstanding of how to build software from a certain perspective, where just make it an option was an escape from having to kind of you shift the responsibility of the design to the users from developers. And this often came from things like somebody leaves you a review in the somebody leaves you a review on Google Play Store saying, I want to be able to do. And what happens then, the developer takes that one and takes it to a letter and says, okay, well, I will allow you to do that. And then what happens is that you accidentally implement that, or you let user design the interface for you. Well, the right answer, that kind of thing, is to take the user feedback and think what the user wants to do, and then design an interface that helps user to do that thing. So you have to take one loop backwards before you jump and implementing those things. But you saw in early phase of Android software a lot of things where all of these requests has became one more step in the setting that was already massively long, and the settings became impossible to use. You didn't find them.
Yeah.
The software became very, very complex to use because that. So there's this kind of misunderstanding what you should do with feedback and what is the kind of the personalization.
I think you'll still see that in the Linux world, actually. In my opinion, if you use something like GNOME, they've simplified it a lot. If you look at KDE, it's still got 1,000 options. I don't use either, but that's still a kind of common topic today. There's I guess at the heart of this thing is maybe we should think about the origin of a software project, because it seems to me that within the term open source, there's this idea of something that gets done as a hobby, or something that gets done, from a point of view of a passion, versus a product which is started out with some sort of commercial. Well, I guess the implication is it's got some commercial reason to it. And if the general trajectory we're looking at is taking open source and using it as the basis for software across Europe, or alternatives in a European ecosystem, alternatives to US software, thinking about the origin is probably important, because why do we need open source even? I'm taking the conversation a bit off the path here, but if we think open source is an enabler, that's great. But we probably need to figure out what is the enabling parts of open source, and what are the bits that are actually going to drive adoption. So I think it goes a bit deeper than usability. I think there's something structural that we're missing in this here.
So the strength and weakness in open source is the same. It's the passion, and it's the idea of everybody can start a project and do things. So there's 99% of software projects that start as open source project as outside businesses will fail. But that's also a strength, because it's kind of natural selection of software. The ones that survive serve a need. Now that's even hobby projects, they start as serving a need. They just start serving my need. I built for my need, and that's not a bad place to start. You build something that solves a problem you have. That's, I think, most people do. Even if it's entertainment, anything, it's still solving a problem. And a lot of commercial software start the same way. It's just with the commercial software, you spend more time to analyzing the problems and so on. But in the open source hobbyist projects, you just jump into it and start writing. And that's the power of the thing. You go into prototype very quickly. I've done multiple projects for myself, and I really enjoy the process, but they never led into anything. So it would be interesting to explore some of the successful open source projects and see where they're coming from and how they turned out to be. Take a Linux kernel, for example. That was hobby of Linus Torvalds in '91 in my university. That was his hobby. He didn't set to build the most used computing platform or kernel in the world, but it just turned out that way because the processes were quite good and he was solving a real problem in the end. And all of the successful open source projects generally are driven either by a strong-minded company. Android is arguably not very open anymore, but it was started from there. But it was driven by a company, for first a person and then a company. And that's why it's successful, because it's built on business needs and all of these things. Linux kernel has nothing to do with hobby projects. I haven't had, many years, and then the Linux Foundation is driving it. There's a lot of money involved, and there's a dictator at the head that really cares about that. So if you look at something like Nextcloud, as far as I understand, Nextcloud also has quite a humble origin on this one, but it's driven by a person who has a really strong will for privacy. It's important to the managers and the people who started the project, the founders of the project. And you can see it, Nextcloud, the privacy is unrivaled. It's clear, but it has a lot of other problems. And my experience, open source projects tend to have very strong aspect, but the other ones seem to be a little bit weaker. There's always the starting these and pushing these things forward. And Nextcloud is a good example. Privacy is fantastic, but it's quite difficult to set up. It's quite difficult to use. There's a lot of problems, and actually some technical bugs as well, which is surprising to me. That might be related to our installation. But are you seeing the same thing, that they seem to, open source seems to always have a strong point and then big weakness, where commercial software seem to be like more balanced in the middle?
Yeah, I think commercial software is a bit more focused, I suppose. It's got a commercial gain. It's got to get into for it to survive at all. It's got to get some adoption, right? Open source projects can survive in theory for a long time with hardly much usage at all. So I think those are different influences. I think the thing that's usability in open source is an important thing. If you see open source as a packaged piece of software, I think there's so many vectors to discuss with open source, but if we just you talked about Audacity earlier, it's a packaged piece of software. I install it, I run it, I use it. There may be some plugins and pieces you can put on top, but that's the piece of software. I think that's just one part of open source, and those are really like usable products that are open source, and those are a very sort of specialized case. I think there's a lot of open source which is the real utility of the open source is probably not in the user interface, but the actual underlying technology service underneath. Let me give you an example. Maybe it's not the right example, but something like Matrix, right, as a communication platform, let's call it like that. That is, there's an open source component, there's an open specification component, but it's not really got a user interface on top, right? And that's led to people who are passionate about that product and think they can build great user interfaces, companies, guys like Element, building on top of this open source foundation. So I think we kind of need to separate them out a bit. When we talk about larger open source in the European context as an alternative way of bringing or of creating a software ecosystem, I'm rather sort of conflicted, I have to say. On the one hand, I think open source as a product. In fact, at FOSDEM, there was a great talk I saw about open code. That idea is a kind of like, I've got a package versus I've got open source as a foundation on top of which I build great user experiences. Personally, I think the second one has a better chance of creating ecosystem. Right. Maybe the first one has a better chance of replacing individual pieces of software. So I think there's a deeper discussion that still needs to be had on those topics as well. There's
going to be in a lot of these things. It comes down to education of the people who run these projects to appreciate the importance of the user. And either model which it goes to, so the initial team is going to build a very usable product. Let's look at the VS Code, for example, open source editor, driven by a company, but really, really usable editor, right? Really popular. Yeah. It became popular because it's quite nice to use. It's not technically superior to Atom or something else. So those kind of things where the core team can create something as a whole package. This is good. Great. But even if it would be fantastic if people would acknowledge their own weaknesses of things. You build something really technically very, very strong, and you just say, okay, well, I don't care about the UI because this is good enough for me. However, I've separated the layers. So you can take the backend and build a new UI on top of my software. Once it becomes popular, I will let somebody else to do that. It's sometimes, I know developers build, their passion projects, they fall in love with that one. It's very difficult to let go. But again, if we had this education of the importance of these things, and people would understand when they start a hobby project and saying like this, okay, well, I'm not a UI designer, I just built something for myself, but I leave door open for somebody come in and make this very popular and widely spread project by adding their information there. That would be quite interesting to see.
So yeah, I think we're kind of touching on the same concept, right? Which is that in part it's to do with the architecture, right? If you architect your open source project on the assumption that the layer on top, the utility layer, the usability, and all of that gets replaced, or maybe it gets split into variations or whatever, and actually what you're building is the core, then we actually, in a strange way, solve this usability problem that we started talking about. Whereas, doesn't matter whether somebody who starts on an open source project understands usability, cares about usability, whatever. Probably not. Maybe we don't care about that. As long as they start the project on the basis that somebody later will come and replace that layer on top. And if that sort of mentality is there, then it's kind of like probably a nice thing, because the open source, the initiator of the open source project would probably love to have somebody else come in and make the software better from a usability perspective without having to do the work themselves. Because if they were passionate about it, they would have started with that already. So the assumption is that that's not a passion point. But I think that's not only just a practical thing, I think it's an ecosystem way of thinking as well. And this is where we also need to shift our mindset on open source in a European context, away from open sources on a project basis to open source on an ecosystem basis. There's a very interesting, if you spend any time reading or listening to Cory Doctorow, who's talks about the Enshittification of software, especially from the US, he will talk about the US copyright law. And the US copyright law is extremely aggressive at stopping anybody building or tampering or extending software mostly built by American companies. And this copyright law actually is forced into markets like Europe through the US government as part of trade deals. So the EU has to adopt in its copyright law the conditions of the US copyright law in order to have the free trade it used to enjoy. So one of the things that open source can do is it can release us from all of this threat of copyright. And that's the promise, in a way, is an open playing field. But we can't just have like chaos. We have to have a mental model as to what we do with open source, to say, well, we have no copyright. We can build on top, we can extend, we can improve things. But we have to be willing as open source developers to want to allow other people to improve the thing we write. So there's probably going to be an evolution of open source thinking. It can't be saying that, hey, I built my thing and I love it and nobody's ever going to touch it again because I'm the only person who's controlling it. More to saying, hey, I've built this enabler to allow a whole series of great tools and products to be built that I probably could never have imagined. Yeah.
Agreed. So that would be power,
I think
right?
usability, it triggers, usability is really, it triggers a thought beyond just making software a bit better. When you really dig into the origin of the problem.
But I think this is a good place to wrap up. There's a lot of more. We just looked at the design. I think we should then a later episode look into productizing, like one circle
Right.
above this one, and look at the whole big picture and see where we would like to see these things going. We talked in the previous episode, sitting on the couch, a little bit about standardization and creating fair playground and all of these kind of things. There's a lot of topics around this one, but I think this is a good place to wrap up for this one, and we'll see where we go in the next one. So I'd say
Great.
thanks for watching, folks.